My name is Jonas Everhart, and for a long time, I didn't think I had a story left worth telling. 4 years ago, the world I knew ended in less than a week. Fever swept through my cabin like fire through dry brush, and before I could understand what was happening, my wife and my boy were gone. I buried them out back in frozen ground, marked the place with stone, and stopped going near it because I couldn't bear to look. The silence that followed wasn't just outside, it was inside me. Before I begin, let me ask you kindly to like this video, leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from, and follow this channel if you want to hear more stories like mine. Your voice matters here, and it helps these stories reach hearts that might need them. Now, let me take you back to the place where my silence began. Each day since had been cut from the same cloth. Wake before dawn, build the fire, check the traps, split wood, and patch the roof when it sagged. Nothing extra, nothing wasted. I ate when I remembered salted beans, a strip of jerky, and sometimes bread if I'd gone into Greymount for flour. Folks at the trading post knew me as the man who never spoke unless spoken to. I didn't care much. After you lose the only voices that ever called you husband and father, what else is there to say? The cabin itself is nothing much. 4 walls of dark timber and a stove that keeps the cold from stealing my breath. A rifle stands by the door, and everything inside has a purpose. No trinkets, no softness, just what a man needs to get through another day. I lived like that because it was easier than remembering. If you stay still long enough, you start to believe you're safe from feeling. But grief doesn't disappear. It lingers in corners, in the sound of a log snapping in the stove, or the creak of floorboards at night. I used to whisper sometimes, just to hear a voice, even if it was only mine. Most days I worked until my hands bled because pain in the palms was easier than the ache in the chest. And at night I'd sit by the fire staring into the flames, trying to remember my boy's laugh before sickness turned it into coughs that shook the rafters. It wasn't courage that kept me alive, only habit. A man can live a long time on habit, even when he's already half gone inside. I told myself that was enough. I'd done my part in this world. I'd built a cabin, loved a woman, held a child, and lost them both. What more was there but to wait out the years? Winter pressed hard that season, harder than most. The wind sawed through the pines, dragging snow against the shutters until it seemed the whole mountain wanted to bury me. I didn't mind. If the roof had caved in, I'd have let it, but it held same as I did, though neither of us seemed meant for much anymore. I thought I had settled into the last chapter of my life, quiet and cold. Yet deep down, I still caught myself listening for sounds that weren't there. A child's footsteps, a woman's voice calling me in from the dark. Hope is a cruel thing when it has nothing to cling to. That night, as I sat with a tin plate of beans and the storm pushed against the walls, I felt the weight of the years pressing heavy on my shoulders. I chewed without tasting, staring at the fire, arms folded like I was holding myself together. Outside, the world was nothing but snow and silence. And then came the knock. It was small at first, easy to mistake for a branch falling against the siding. But it came again, 3 sharp raps that cut through the howl of the wind. I froze, my plate half raised. My breath caught like I'd forgotten how to take the next one. Nobody came this far into the pines. Nobody knocked on my door. My first thought was caution. Men sometimes came looking for trouble, and trouble had a way of finding a man alone. I took the rifle in my hand, though I held it low, and walked to the door. Cold air slapped me the moment I cracked it open, and what I saw will never leave me. She was standing there barefoot in the snow, her dress torn and soaked through, her lips trembling so hard I could barely hear the words she whispered. Please. Her arms wrapped tight around her belly, swollen with child. Her face was bruised, pale with cold, and her eyes, those eyes carried the weight of someone who had been pushed past breaking and somehow kept moving. I didn't move at first. My instinct told me to be wary. A woman out here this far in the heart of a storm. Nothing about it made sense. But then again, not everything is meant to. She wasn't hiding a weapon. She wasn't carrying anything at all. She looked like she'd been stripped of everything except the will to make it to that door. I stepped back, and she staggered inside, falling to her knees near the stove, as if the warmth alone might keep her alive. Snow clung to her hair. Her feet were cracked and bleeding, and the sight of her near broke the silence I had built my life around. I shut the door, bolted it against the storm, and set the rifle aside. For years, I'd told myself I didn't need another soul in this cabin, that I was safer alone. But as I looked at her curled on the floor, clutching her belly like she was holding the world inside, something shifted in me. I didn't know her name, her story, or if she would survive the night. All I knew was that I couldn't let her die here, not at my door. And that is where the rest of this story begins. The sound of that knock still lingers in my bones like it cracked something open in me that had been sealed for years. It came quick, sharp against the wood 3 times in a rhythm that was steady but weak, like the person on the other side had just enough strength left to make me hear them. At first, I told myself it was nothing but the storm, some loose branch smacking against the siding, or maybe the mountain shifting as the cold froze rock and timber until they split with a sound like gunfire. I sat there with my plate of beans cooling in my hands, my jaw tight, my chest thudding in a way it hadn't in years. Then it came again, faint but certain, and I knew I couldn't pretend anymore. My rifle was leaning in its place by the door, and my hand went to it out of habit, not out of meanness, just the way a man alone learns to be cautious. The woods don't give much mercy, and people even less. I held it low, not raised, just enough to steady myself as I slid the bolt and cracked the door. The cold slapped me like a fist, sharp enough to sting my eyes, and in that gust of white, there she was. A woman, barefoot, half collapsed, her dress torn and soaked through, her arms wrapped tight around her swollen belly. Her lips were blue, trembling, and when she spoke, it wasn't more than a broken whisper. Please. Just that word, torn in half by the wind, and it cut through every wall I'd built inside me. I remember standing there a long second, frozen in more ways than one. My mind spun with questions. Who was she? Was someone behind her driving her toward me? Was this some kind of trick, bait to lure a man off his guard? But none of those thoughts stuck, not when I looked at her face. There were bruises blooming purple and yellow along her jaw and collar, and her eyes were too empty for lies. Whatever she was hiding from, it wasn't me. She had nothing left to carry but the child pressing against her ribs, and the will to keep moving until she reached a door that would open. I stepped back without a word, and she staggered past me like the strength it took to knock had burned the last of her. She fell to her knees near the stove, curling into herself as if the fire might sew her back together. I shut the door hard against the storm, bolted it, and leaned the rifle back in its place. My heart was racing, though I tried not to show it. I kept glancing at the window, at the curtain edges lifting with the draft. half expecting shadows to follow her. But there was nothing out there except snow beating the world into silence. She didn't look at me, didn't speak again, just crouched with her face close to the heat, her body shivering so hard, her shoulders shook beneath the torn fabric. Her feet were raw, cracked, and bleeding, the skin white at the edges where frostbite had begun its work. Her hands trembled as she pulled the blanket tighter around her belly, like she was trying to shield the child from what the world had already done to her. I moved slow, careful, pulled a wool blanket from the crate by my cot, and laid it across her shoulders. She flinched when my shadow crossed, but she didn't pull away when the weight of it settled over her. That was when I felt something stir in me I thought I'd buried with my wife and boy. A flicker of duty, maybe mercy, maybe something older than words. I went about the room then, restless in my own skin, setting a kettle on the stove, cutting strips of dried meat, tossing in root pieces until the smell of stew rose up through the cabin. I told myself it was habit, that a man ought to eat warm when the storm's howling outside, but the truth was I wanted her to feel a little less alone. She never looked at me, not once. Her eyes stayed low, her face pale with exhaustion. But her breaths came steadier the longer the fire burned. When the stew was ready, I poured it into a bowl and set it on the small table by her side. She didn't reach for it, not at first, and I didn't push her. Sometimes the body's too worn to care about food, but I figured she'd take it when she was ready. I carried my own plate to the corner chair and sat with my arms crossed, pretending to watch the fire. Though my eyes kept straying back to her, I thought then how strange it was to have another soul under my roof after all these years, especially one who looked more like a shadow than a woman. Part of me wanted to ask who she was, where she'd come from, if there was danger close behind. But the larger part of me knew questions could wait. She hadn't knocked on my door to tell her story. She knocked because she was out of time. So I kept my silence, though my mind raced. I wondered if she'd make it through the night, wondered if she had the strength left to deliver that child, wondered what kind of man had put those bruises on her skin. And I felt something else, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. A reason to stay awake, to keep watch, to care. As the wind screamed outside and the shutters groaned, I knew that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. She didn't say a word that first night, not one, just huddled by the stove, as though the heat was the only thing tethering her to this world. The blanket I had draped over her shoulders slid halfway down, but she gripped it with her fingers like she was afraid I might take it back. I remember watching the steam rise from the kettle as it warmed and thinking how strange it felt to have another breath moving inside these four walls again. For years, the only sounds had been the crackle of wood, the scrape of my boots on the floor, the sigh of the wind pressing against the logs. Now there was her breathing, ragged at first, then slow and uneven, like each inhale was borrowed time. I kept my distance, not wanting to crowd her, but my eyes kept drifting toward the bruises on her face and the way she wrapped her arms around her belly, holding herself as if everything inside her might spill out if she loosened her grip. When I set the bowl of stew on the table, she didn't reach for it, just stared at the fire with a look I knew too well. The look of someone clinging to heat, not for comfort, but for survival. I didn't press her, didn't speak, just pulled my chair into the corner and sat, with my arms crossed, chewing jerky and beans that had long gone cold. The truth was, I wasn't hungry anymore. My mind wouldn't quiet. I kept thinking about her bare feet, cracked and bleeding from the frost, the way she'd stumbled through the door half dead, the way her voice had broken on that one word, please. I'd told myself long ago I was done with the business of caring for others. But there she was, forcing me to care whether I wanted to or not. Sometime near midnight, she curled on her side, knees pulled tight, one hand pressed beneath her belly, the blanket slipping halfway to the floor. I pulled my cot closer to the fire and, without a word, lifted her into it. She was light, too light, bones pressing sharp beneath torn fabric. She stiffened at my touch, eyes flying open as if she expected a blow. But when I set her down gently and stepped back, her breathing slowed again. She kept her gaze on me, unblinking, and I gave her space, lowering myself back into the corner chair. I didn't sleep a wink that night. The storm rattled the windows, but my ears stayed fixed on her shallow breaths, listening for any change, any sign she was slipping away. By morning, the storm had eased, leaving a thick hush over the valley. Snow piled heavy on the sill, and the light that slipped through the shutters painted the room pale. She was still awake when I stood, her eyes open, clearer than the night before. I poured hot water into a basin, laid out a cloth, and stepped back to give her privacy. She rose slowly, bracing herself with both arms, her belly shifting under the coat, and dipped the cloth into the basin, pressing it against her face with trembling hands. When the grime lifted, her features showed clearer, and I could see she wasn't much more than a girl, though hardship had carved years into her skin. Her dress was split at the seam, the fabric torn at the neckline, and I wondered what she'd gone through to arrive at my door looking like that. I didn't ask. She wasn't ready, and I wasn't sure I was either. I busied myself sweeping the floor, though it was already clean. Anything to give her room to breathe without me staring. When I turned back, she had her eyes on me, wary, but not as dull as before. I saw something flicker there. Not trust. Not yet, but a kind of defiance that told me whatever she'd run from hadn't broken her spirit entirely. That afternoon, I dug through the cedar chest and found my wife's old coat, thick and lined with fur. I laid it on the cot and went outside to chop wood, half expecting she'd refuse it. But when I returned, she was standing by the window with the coat wrapped around her shoulders, one hand trailing across the dusty sill, as if she was reminding herself this place was real. She didn't ask permission, and I didn't offer any. When our eyes met, I gave a small nod. She looked away, but something in her posture had eased just a hair. It was then I realized how starved she must be, not just for food, but for the smallest piece of safety. That evening, she finally touched the bowl of stew I set before her, lifting the spoon with unsteady hands, eating slow, her eyes fixed on the firelight. I sat nearby, not speaking, not moving, just letting her know without words that she wasn't alone in that room. As she scraped the bottom of the bowl, her lips parted, and a sound slipped out, softer than the snow falling outside. Thank you. Just 2 words, but they cut deep because it had been years since anyone had spoken them to me. I looked at her then, really looked, and felt something stir in my chest I hadn't felt since before the fever took my family. I didn't say anything back, but I knew it already. The silence I had lived in was broken, and it would never be the same again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm I hadn't expected, quiet but different from the silence I'd carried alone all those years. She was still a stranger, still cautious in her every move, But the way she lingered near the fire, the way she folded the blanket when she rose in the morning, the way she wiped the table with the edge of her sleeve as if she had to keep her hands busy, it all stitched itself into the fabric of my days before I realized it. She spoke little, sometimes not at all, but the silence between us wasn't the same as before. It wasn't heavy, not hollow, just shared. I found myself listening for the sound of her steps across the floorboards, soft and uneven at first, then steadier as her feet began to heal. She'd limp to the basin to wash, or to the window, where she'd stand with one hand braced on the ledge, her breath fogging the glass, eyes fixed on the pines, as if measuring whether the world outside meant danger or freedom. I didn't ask her what she saw. I didn't ask her anything at all, though my mind was crowded with questions. I knew better than to press. A person who shows up at your door half dead doesn't owe you answers. Survival comes first, and trust, if it ever comes, has to be earned slow. Still, I couldn't help but wonder. When I stepped out to the traps or to split wood, I thought about her inside, moving through my cabin with hands that worked as though they'd done it 1,000 times before. I'd hear the scrape of a chair against the floor when I came back, or the soft clang of tin as she set dishes to dry. She wasn't idle, not once, even when her body was still sore, even when her breath caught from bending too quick. I saw the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she refused to let pain keep her down, and something inside me respected it more than I could say. That first week, I found myself watching her from the corner of my eye, careful not to let it show. She flinched less each day, though her shoulders still tensed whenever I crossed too close. And I made a point of moving slow, keeping distance, giving her space. One evening, I came in with rabbits from the line, laid them on the table, and before I could reach for my knife, she stepped forward. "I can do it," she said, her voice firm, though quiet. I studied her for a moment, then handed her the blade. Her hands were steady, surer than I expected, and she worked the skins off with no waste, no hesitation, as if she'd learned long ago that survival doesn't wait on comfort. I said nothing, just nodded once, but inside, I felt something shift again. This wasn't a woman made of weakness. She'd been broken in places, yes, but she'd mended herself enough to stand, and that mattered more to me than any words. Nights came early that winter, the snow still heavy on the ground, and when the fire died low, she'd curl on the cot wrapped in the wool coat I'd given her, one hand beneath her belly, the other tucked under her cheek. I'd unroll my bedroll on the floor nearby, the way I always did, but my ears never let go of her breathing. It comforted me in ways I couldn't explain, like proof that the world hadn't ended after all. Some nights, just as I drifted towards sleep, I'd catch her whispering to herself. Words too low to understand, maybe prayers, maybe promises, maybe nothing more than a mother trying to remind her child she was still here. And each time, I turned my face towards the fire and let the warmth of it sink into me, pretending I wasn't listening. I thought then how strange it was, how quickly the cabin had changed. Before her, every day had bled into the next until I stopped caring what day it was at all. Now I marked time by her small movements, the way her bruise faded from purple to yellow, the way her steps grew steadier, the way her eyes, though still guarded, no longer looked as if she was waiting to die. I realized I wasn't just living beside her. I was watching her come back to life, piece by piece. And in the quiet of those days, I felt myself stirring too. I still hadn't asked her name, still didn't know where she'd come from or who she'd left behind, but I knew this much. She had chosen to walk until she reached my door, and I had chosen to open it. That choice bound us in a way neither of us spoke out loud, but it hung between us all the same, steady as the crackle of the fire and the slow drip of snow melting from the roof. And though I didn't say it, though I hardly dared to think it, the truth settled deeper in me with each passing day. The silence I once thought was all I had left was no longer mine alone. And for the first time in years, I didn't mind. It was on the 5th morning that she finally spoke more than a handful of words, and I reckon I'll never forget the weight they carried. We had settled into a rhythm of sorts by then. I'd rise before dawn, stoke the fire, step out to check the traps or split wood. And when I came back, she would be moving slow around the cabin, her steps still tender but steady now. She had begun to take small things into her hands without asking, folding blankets, sweeping the corner by the hearth, mending the frayed sleeve of that coat she wore. It didn't feel like intrusion. It felt like a woman who had learned that survival was in the details. That morning, I came back with a cut across my palm, the steel of the trap having slipped when I reset it. Blood ran warm down my wrist. But I didn't think much of it until she looked up from the chair where she'd been sewing. Her eyes caught the red. And before I could wave it off, she rose and said, "Sit." There was no hesitation in her tone, no ask, just a command, quiet but certain. I sat because something in her voice told me not to argue. She worked over my hand with a surety that surprised me, tearing a strip of cloth, cleaning the wound with whiskey I'd set aside and binding it tight. She didn't glance at me, not once, just focused on the cut, her fingers moving quick and steady. When she tied the knot, I asked softly, "Someone did that to you?" My eyes had landed on her wrist, where the sleeve had slipped back, showing the edge of old bruises, yellowing now but still clear. Her hands froze a moment, then finished the knot without meeting my gaze. She straightened and leaned against the wall, arms crossed over her chest. "My stepbrother," she said flat, like she was telling me the weather. The words hit like a stone, blunt and cold. She didn't tremble, didn't soften, just laid the truth out between us. "He sold me," she added after a pause. My jaw clenched tight, but I didn't speak. I knew if I opened my mouth too soon, anger might come spilling out, and anger wouldn't do her any good. She went on, her eyes fixed on the fire. "He told me he'd found a buyer in Reno, said I'd be taken care of. I was 6 months along. They gave him $30. Her hand moved instinctively to her belly as she spoke, resting just beneath the curve. My stomach turned at the thought. I'd seen men do cruel things in my life, but this, selling your own kin, and a woman carrying a child, it hollowed me out. She lifted her chin slightly, still staring into the flames. I ran the second night, stole a horse, got thrown, walked the rest barefoot. Her voice was steady, but I heard what lay beneath it, that iron thread of defiance that had carried her through the snow until she reached my door. I nodded slow because what could I say that wouldn't sound empty? There aren't words enough to make sense of a world that breaks a woman like that. She didn't want pity. I could see it clear in the set of her shoulders. So I didn't offer any. I just let the truth of her story settle into me, heavier than the storm outside had ever been. That night, the firelight caught her face softer than before. She had eaten more. Her color was returning, but her eyes still carried shadows I couldn't reach. I thought about how she had chosen to tell me, not because I asked, but because She wanted to. That meant something. Trust, however small, had begun to grow between us. I didn't try to fill the silence after. I just sat there, watching her mend a rip in one of the curtains, her hands working with a steady rhythm. And I felt an ache in my chest I hadn't known in years. Not grief, not fear, but respect. Respect for the way she had walked barefoot through snow, when most would have laid down and died. Respect for the way she spoke the truth without flinching. Respect for the way she still carried herself with dignity, even after being stripped of nearly everything. Later, when I rose and went to the shelf, I took down a folded flannel dress, dark green with lace at the hem, one my wife had worn long ago. I held it out without a word. She looked at it, then at me. Her voice dropped low. "I don't need charity." "It's not charity," I said. "It's a dress." She stood slow, her hands trembling just slightly as she took it from me. For the first time since she had arrived, her eyes softened. "Thank you," she whispered. I nodded and turned away, but inside me something had cracked open. I had lived 4 years in silence, convinced nothing good could grow from the ashes of loss. Yet here she was, proof that even after the worst a man or woman can endure, there's still fight left, still the possibility of something new. As I lay down that night on my bedroll by the fire, I listened to her breathing from the cot, and I realized I was no longer listening just to be sure she was alive. I was listening because her presence filled the cabin in a way I hadn't thought possible, and in that moment I knew that whatever came next, I was bound to her story now, and she was bound to mine. It was past midnight when she woke me with nothing more than my name, spoken low and tight, but I heard the strain in it before my eyes even opened. "Jonas," she whispered. One hand braced against the wall, the other clutching her belly, sweat already shining on her brow, though the cabin air was cool. I was on my feet before I could think, guiding her toward the back room I had cleared weeks ago for this moment I knew was coming. She leaned hard into me, her body trembling, and for the first time she didn't resist my touch, didn't hold herself back. She just let me bear the weight as we moved. I set her down slow on the cot, laid out the linens my wife had once stitched before our boy was born, and fetched water from the kettle. My hands shook, though I tried to steady them, not out of fear for myself, but for her, for the life she carried, for the weight of knowing it all rested in these 2 hands that hadn't saved anyone in years. She gritted her teeth as the first pain tore through her, her fingers curling into the blanket, her breath catching sharp in her throat. She didn't scream, didn't thrash, just bore down with a strength that startled me, whispering words I couldn't make out, prayers or curses, maybe both. I sat by her side, wiping her face with a damp cloth, keeping my voice low, though I didn't know if it gave her any comfort. "You're not alone," I said. And it was the only truth I had to give. Hours blurred, the fire snapped, water hissed, her groans filled the cabin like waves breaking over rock. I had seen death, I had buried my family with my own hands, but I had never witnessed life claw its way into the world with such raw force. My chest ached with every sound she made, and more than once I prayed under my breath, prayed though I hadn't spoken to God in years. When her strength faltered, I held her arm and steadied her. When her breath grew shallow, I urged her slow and steady. She met each pain with a defiance I knew well by then, the same defiance that had carried her through snow and hunger to my door. Dawn was breaking, pale light pressing through the shutter cracks, when the room finally filled with a different sound. A cry, thin and piercing, rising above the hush of the storm outside. I lifted the child, small and red-faced, fists clenched tight, lungs proving stronger than her tiny frame. My throat closed up as I wrapped her in wool and turned to Ruth. She lay back against the cot, her chest heaving, tears sliding down her cheeks, not sobs, just quiet relief. "She's here," I told her, my voice rough as gravel. And when she reached out her arms, I placed the child into them. The look on her face near undid me, all the fear and fight giving way to a tenderness so raw it stilled me where I stood. She kissed the baby's head, cradled her close, and for the first time since she'd come through my door, I saw something like peace in her eyes. I sat there on the edge of the cot, sweat and blood staining my shirt, my hands shaking as I stared at them, mother and child, and felt something in me shift, so heavy I had to lower my head. For years, I had lived with nothing but loss, silence my only companion, and now here in this room, in the same cabin that once buried my joy, new life had broken through. I wanted to believe it was more than chance that maybe Grace had found me again. She looked up at me then, her voice soft but steady. "She needs a name." I swallowed hard, because I had once chosen a name for a child, and that memory burned even now. "You decide," I told her. She traced her finger along the baby's cheek and whispered, "Elena." It was almost mine once, and I always kept it close. I nodded, my chest tight. Elena, then. The name fit. It felt like hope wrapped in a word. The baby yawned, pressed tighter against her mother, and Ruth smiled through her tears. "You're a good man, Jonas," she said softly. I looked down, not ready to take those words, not certain I deserved them. I don't know if that's true. She reached for my hand, her fingers weak but warm. I do. The cabin was hushed, but for the fire crackling, snow sliding off the roof outside, and the soft sound of the child breathing between us. I sat there for a long time, keeping watch, not because I feared danger, but because I couldn't look away from the sight of them. And for the first time in 4 long years, the silence I had dreaded didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The days that followed Elena's birth settled into a rhythm I hadn't known I was missing. A rhythm shaped by need, by small moments, by the sound of a child's cry cutting through the silence that used to own this place. Ruth rested more at first, her body still sore, her steps cautious, but even in her weariness, she was fierce in her care. She held the baby close almost every hour, humming low, her eyes softening each time Elena stirred. I moved through the cabin quieter than I had in years, fetching water, stoking the fire, chopping wood before dawn so the cold wouldn't creep in. It wasn't duty, not the way chores had been before. It was something else, something heavier but lighter all at once. For years, my hands had only worked to keep me alive, but now, every split log, every pot of stew, every trap line checked was for them as much as for me, and I felt it in my bones. Elena's cries were small, sharp at first, then soft and fading as soon as she found her mother's chest or the cradle I had lined with fresh wool. I was clumsy the first time I held her, my hands stiff as boards, terrified I might break her. But Ruth watched me with steady eyes and said, "She's stronger than she looks." And when that tiny weight settled against my chest, her breaths, quick and shallow, I felt the world pause. She calmed quicker than I expected, her small fist curling into the fabric of my shirt. And I sat there by the fire, not moving for what must have been an hour, afraid that if I shifted, the spell would break. Ruth smiled faintly then, the first true smile I'd seen from her. and it carved something deep into me. Nights came easier now, though I rarely slept. I'd sit in the corner chair, listening to the crackle of the fire, to Ruth humming low while Elena fed, to the soft creak of the cradle when she laid her down. Sometimes I'd read from the only book left in the cabin, my wife's old volume, my voice low and steady, the words more for Ruth than the child. I noticed how her hands would still when I read, how her breathing slowed, and though she never said it, I knew she liked hearing my voice fill the room. It surprised me, too, how natural it felt after years of silence. She began to move easier by the second week, no longer gripping the wall to steady herself. Her steps less cautious. She swept the floor again, folded blankets, and one morning I found her outside scattering feed for the hens, Elena wrapped tight in her shawl. The sight stopped me in my tracks. Her hair loose in the breeze, the green flannel dress I'd given her stretched to the seams, her body still carrying the weight of birth, but her stance strong, steady, like a woman who had found her ground again. When she caught me watching, she said, "I figure I should earn my keep." And I answered without thinking, "You already have." She looked at me a moment longer, not smiling exactly, but close, and then turned back to the hens. That small exchange carried more than words could hold. Days passed in patterns that grew familiar. Breakfast shared by the fire, Ruth mending or sewing while I worked outside, evenings with Elena in one of our arms as the sun set behind the ridge. I realized I had started marking time again, not by the sun alone, but by her movements, her laugh when it came, the way Elena's eyes began to follow light across the ceiling. I'd stopped caring about time years ago, letting one day bleed into the next, until all I had was the sameness of loss. But now I found myself counting the days since she knocked on my door, the weeks since the baby was born, the moments that strung themselves into something more than survival. It startled me how much had changed in so little time. One evening, Ruth sat by the cradle while I carved a small wooden rabbit for Elena to grip one day. Ruth watched my hands move with the knife, her expression soft, and said quietly, "She'll grow up knowing this was her home." I swallowed hard at that, because I had thought of this cabin only as a place to endure, not as a home. But hearing her call it that made me see it different. The walls no longer echoed with emptiness. The fire no longer burned for one. When I lay down at night and heard Ruth's breathing from the cot and the baby's soft murmurs, I didn't feel the hollow silence pressing in. I felt something else, something steadier. It wasn't joy yet, not fully, but it was a peace I hadn't believed would return. And as I lay there staring at the ceiling beams, I realized I was no longer living just to endure another day. I was living to see what the next would bring. It was near the end of winter when the sound of hooves broke the stillness of the ridge, a sound I hadn't heard since before Ruth came. The rhythm of it reached me first as I split kindling by the shed, steady and deliberate, not the wild pace of a rider in flight, but the measured gait of a man who knew where he was going. My chest tightened the way it always did when the world outside came knocking again. I set the axe down, wiped my palms against my trousers, and reached for the rifle leaning near the door. Inside, Ruth heard it too. She appeared at the threshold, Elena clutched against her chest, her face gone pale. I didn't need to tell her to stay inside, but the words came anyway. "Stay with the baby," I said, keeping my voice steady. She didn't argue, though her body was stiff as wood. I stepped onto the porch as the rider came into view, a broad-shouldered man in a brown coat, his hat pulled low. a badge catching the weak light on his chest, a marshal. He slowed his horse to a walk, removed his gloves, and nodded at me like a man taking stock of the ground before he spoke. "Jonas Everhart?" he asked. His voice was calm, even, but it carried the weight of authority. I gave a slow nod, my rifle loose in my grip, but angled low. "Yeah." He glanced toward the cabin, his eyes sharp, then back to me. "I heard a woman came through here weeks back, pregnant, might have been fleeing from a sale out near Reno. You seen anyone like that?" My heart thudded heavy, but my face stayed flat. I didn't hesitate, not a breath. "That's my wife," I said. "She gave birth here. That's our child." The words left my mouth steady as if I'd spoken them 100 times before. But inside, I felt the weight of them settle deep. Behind me, I knew Ruth stood frozen in the doorway, silent, the baby pressed tight against her chest. I kept my eyes on the marshal, steady as stone, daring him to doubt me. His gaze lingered on me, hard and searching, then shifted to the cabin. I felt sweat bead at the back of my neck despite the cold. He was measuring everything the way I stood, the way Ruth held the child, the way the cabin looked lived in, not borrowed. After a long moment, he nodded slow. "You sure?" he asked. "I am," I said, my jaw tight. "She's my wife. That's our baby." The marshal studied me another beat, then tipped his hat. "All right then." No law against a man protecting his own. He slid his gloves back on, tugged the reins, and turned his horse. As the sound of hooves faded back down the trail, I let out the breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My hand eased off the rifle, but my chest still hammered like a drum. I stepped back inside and bolted the door, my eyes finding Ruth where she stood in the doorway, her face tight with fear, but her eyes locked on me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, "You didn't even flinch." I set the rifle aside, pulled off my gloves, and said, "Didn't need to." Her eyes softened then, filling with something more than relief, and she crossed the room to me, Elena cradled in her arm. Without hesitation, she pressed her lips to mine, not careful, not shy, but with the certainty of someone who had already chosen. I kissed her back, slow and steady, and in that moment, I felt the truth of what I had said. She was mine, not because I claimed her, but because I had decided to stay and she had decided to let me. That night, after the baby slept and the fire had burned down to glowing coals, I sat by the window, staring out into the snow-dark woods. My hands rested heavy on my knees, my thoughts circling back to the marshal's eyes, the way he had weighed me like a man trying to find cracks in the stone. For years, I'd lived with nothing to lose, no lies to tell, no one to shield. But when I spoke those words, "That's my wife, that's our child," I knew they weren't a lie. They were truer than anything I'd said in years. Inside me, something settled, not fear, not dread, but resolve. The world might come knocking again, and if it did, I'd meet it head on. I looked over at Ruth, curled on the cot, her body tucked around Elena's, her hair loose across her cheek. She looked small, like that, softer, but I knew. She had walked barefoot through snow, carried a child through pain, and stood in silence as I shielded her with my words. She was strong. Enough to survive, and I was strong enough to keep her safe. As I sat there watching her, I felt the cabin breathe with us. No longer hollow, no longer mine alone. It belonged to us now, all three of us. And the silence that once pressed down like a weight had turned into something else, something full, something steady, something worth protecting. It's a strange thing, how love can come back into a man's life without him even realizing it until it's there, sitting steady in his chest like it had been waiting all along. After the marshal rode off and the danger passed, something shifted between us that neither of us needed to name. Ruth looked at me different, not as a stranger who'd taken her in, not as a man she owed thanks to, but as someone she could lean against without fear of falling. And I felt it in myself too, though I carried it quiet, the way a man carries anything he's afraid might break if spoken too soon. The days went on as before, chopping wood, checking traps, rocking Elena when her cries came sharp in the night. But there was more in the silence now. It wasn't just shared breath or the scrape of a chair against the floorboards. It was trust. It was her eyes meeting mine and not looking away. It was her laughter, the first time I muttered about that stubborn hen that pecked at my boots, soft at first like she didn't remember how, then stronger when she saw I wasn't surprised to hear it. That laugh lingered in the air long after she'd gone quiet, and I carried it with me through the day like a fire tucked into my coat. One evening, as the snow melted into patches along the ridge, we sat together on the porch steps, the sky wide and clear, the air carrying the scent of pine sap and thawed earth. Elena was bundled in Ruth's arms, already drifting to sleep, and the world felt still in a way I hadn't felt in years. Ruth turned her head toward me, her voice low. I thought maybe after the baby I'd move on and try to find work, maybe a town. My chest tightened, though I didn't let it show. I kept my eyes on the tree line and asked, "And now?" She looked down at the baby, brushed her cheek with one finger and whispered, "Now I don't want to. I don't think I could anyway. I don't want her growing up wondering why the man who stayed disappeared." Her words struck deep, and I turned to her then, letting her see what I'd been holding inside. "I don't want you to leave," I said. Her hand shifted, resting over mine, her touch warm even through the chill. "You sure?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. I come with a lot of noise. I couldn't help but laugh, soft but real. I've been living in silence too long. That night we lay in the bedroll together, not just from weariness, not just for warmth, but because we had both decided something without saying it. She curled against me, her breath brushing my neck, and I felt the weight of her body settle into mine. With a trust that nearly undid me, I pressed my hand to her back, steady, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't dream of loss. I dreamt of tomorrow. We didn't speak much about what we were becoming, because words sometimes cheapen what silence holds better. But in the small moments, her hand brushing mine when we set dishes to dry, the way she reached for me when Elena stirred in the night, the way I found myself reading aloud just so she could rest her head back and listen, we both knew. There was a night when she asked me straight, her voice soft but steady, "If I asked you to stay with me, would you?" I turned to her, met her eyes, and said, "I've already stayed." She breathed out slow, a sound closer to a prayer than a sigh, and kissed me. It wasn't desperate, it wasn't rushed. It was quiet and sure, like two people finding their way back to something they thought they'd lost forever. My hands found her waist, careful of her still healing body, and hers slipped behind my neck. When her lips touched mine, I felt the years of silence crack apart, and all that was left was warmth. From that night on, something settled between us, not heavy, not uncertain, but rooted. We laughed more, spoke more. She teased me once about how little I said, and I answered, "Don't need many words when you mean what you say." She smiled at that, the kind of smile that starts in the eyes and lingers. I realized then that love doesn't come with fanfare, not out here, not after what we'd both lost. It comes in the quiet ways. A man fixing a latch he'd ignored for months because now he has a reason. A woman mending a shirt with careful hands because she wants him to wear it another season. A baby calming at the sound of both their voices. And in those days, I felt something I thought I'd buried with my wife and boy. I felt alive again. Not because grief had vanished, it never does, but because life had taken root alongside it. Ruth had walked barefoot through snow, carried a child through pain, and found her way to my door. I had opened it, and now here we were, not just surviving, but choosing each other. For the first time since the fever took everything from me, I understood what it meant to stay. And I knew, as sure as the ground beneath my boots, that I wasn't going anywhere. Before I close the story, I want to ask you kindly to like this video, leave a comment to let us know where you're watching from, and follow the channel so you don't miss the next story. These small things matter more than you know, and they help keep voices like mine alive. Now, let me tell you how it all came together. Spring came early that year. The snow melted from the ridge quicker than I expected. Streams ran heavy with thaw, and the pines smelled of sap and new life. I remember standing on the porch one morning, the sun breaking over the hills, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was bracing myself against the day. Inside, Ruth was humming as she rocked Elena, and I realized this cabin, once nothing but 4 walls of survival, had become a home. It wasn't grand, it wasn't free of cracks or weather stains, but it carried warmth, laughter, and a future. When I look back on it, the change didn't come in one sweeping moment, but in 1,000 small ones. The way Ruth's hand found mine in the dark, the way Elena's cries softened at the sound of my voice, the way Ruth stitched a little pillow for the cradle from scraps of cloth she found at the bottom of a chest. None of it looked like much to the outside eye, but to me, it was proof that life can grow again, even out of the ashes of loss. We chose to marry simple. No guests, no flowers, no music, just a preacher from Greymount who rode up the ridge with his worn Bible tucked under his coat. We stood beneath the pine tree out back, boots sinking into soft dirt, birds flicking between the branches overhead. Ruth wore the green flannel dress again, repaired for the last time, her hair pulled back but loose at the edges. She held Elena in one arm and my hand in the other. And when the preacher asked, "Do you take this woman?" I answered without hesitation, "I already have." Ruth smiled, not wide but steady, and said, "I do." When it was finished, we signed a page torn from the back of his Bible, handed him a satchel of biscuits and jerky for his trouble, and watched him ride off down the ridge. No one cheered, no music rose, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the look in her eyes when we stepped back into the cabin. We weren't surviving anymore. We were building. I've learned something in these months that I never understood before. A man can lose everything, bury what he loves most, and still find himself standing at the edge of a new beginning if he chooses not to close his door when the knock comes. Grief will always walk beside me, I know that. I still think of my wife and boy, their laughter, the sound of them moving through these rooms, but their memory doesn't choke me the way it used to. Instead, it sits beside me like an old scar, reminding me of what was lost, but also what was found. Ruth and Elena didn't replace what I buried. They gave me something else, something whole in its own right. Ruth told me once late at night with the fire low, "You didn't save me, Jonas, you stayed. That's what made the difference." I carry those words with me. Staying doesn't sound like much, but I know now it's everything. Anyone can run. Anyone can turn away. It takes something else entirely to stay when the storms come, to hold ground when silence would be easier. And that's what we do now. Every day, we stay. I watch Ruth with our daughter, yes, ours, and I see strength I can hardly name. I see a woman who walked barefoot through snow, who carried bruises that told more truth than words ever could. And yet here she is, laughing softly as Elena grips her finger with tiny fists. I see the way she looks at me across the table, not with fear, not with doubt, but with trust. And in that trust, I found a kind of peace I thought I'd never touch again. Evenings are my favorite. The fire crackles, Ruth hums low, and I carve little animals for Elena to play with when she grows old enough. Sometimes Ruth reads the old book aloud, her voice carrying across the room, and I close my eyes just to listen. Other times I read, and she leans her head back with a smile that makes me believe the world isn't as cruel as it once seemed. That's what love looks like out here. Not grand declarations, not promises shouted into the wind, but steady hands, shared silence, and the choice to keep showing up. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that hope doesn't come when you chase it. It comes when you least expect it, sometimes barefoot, bruised and half frozen at your door. And when it does, you have to choose. You can shut the door, turn back to silence, let yourself stay buried in grief, or you can open it, risk the unknown, and find that life still has room for love. I chose to open it, and it gave me back more than I ever thought I'd have. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this. Don't be afraid to stay when staying matters. Don't be afraid to open the door. Because on the other side of loss, there can still be life. On the other side of silence, there can still be laughter. And on the other side of grief, if you're willing, there can still be love.